What then did the government tell Hollywood to do? It told them, quote, for example, show people bringing their own sugar when invited out to dinner, carrying their own parcels when shopping, traveling on planes or trains with light luggage, uncomplainingly giving up seats for servicemen and others traveling on war priorities. Show persons accepting tire and gas rationing cheerfully. Show well-dressed persons, obviously car owners, riding in crowded buses and streetcars. To bring home the realities of war, Hollywood was told to, quote, unostensibly show a few wounded men. Prepare people, but do not alarm them against the casualties to come. In other words, Hollywood would be a crucial vehicle for government communication and propaganda. Hollywood was also asked to show that this was truly a democratic war, to show African American soldiers in crowd scenes and occasionally black officers. The advice was quite specific that the government provided. Don't make blanket condemnations of all Germans and all Japanese, as this country does not regard the Germans and Japanese people as our enemies, only their leaders. Don't show Chinese in menial servant positions. Don't show Englishmen at lavish banquets, since a theme of Axis propaganda is that U.S. food is being squandered by our allies while people at home tighten their belts. It's remarkable how detailed these suggestions are. Don't show American heroes as cocky, bumptious, or undisciplined, because such screen heroics are resented overseas. A picture titled America had a sit-down strike that had to be cut because it suggested labor management conflict. What we're seeing is how the government is sanitizing the picture of the country presented on the screen. A special concern was movies that depicted our allies in an offensive manner. The government stopped the release of a film based on the Rudyard Kipling story, Kim, because it would give aid and comfort to those who criticized the British for fighting solely to keep their colonies. Another film opposed by the government was The General Died at Dawn. It depicted Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of China, as a cruel warlord, opposed by Gary Cooper playing Mao Zedong, as a man of the people. The British were resentful because Objective Burma presented Errol Flynn winning the Battle of Burma single-handedly, even though it was a British operation. It was government export restrictions that really controlled Hollywood output. Hollywood was forbidden to export gangster movies because gangster movies might give foreigners the impression that America was not made up of law-abiding people. Scenes showing racial discrimination were prohibited. Films that painted Americans as superheroes winning battles single-handedly, these too were prohibited. Subjects that showed America as oblivious to the war or being the only nation involved in fighting the Axis, these too were barred. Throughout the 1920s, the 1930s, and the 1940s, moving pictures were connected to the public in rich, communal ways. The movie experience was a lot different than it has since become. There was something about vaudeville and hokum in the movies. There were dish nights. There were bouncing ball sing-alongs, which maybe you guys don't even remember anymore. But there was also something of the town hall meeting, or theater, or even church when you went to the movies. So when the movies with a vengeance turned their energies to the war effort, they reflected and they energized the public's sentiments. Films were specifically made as morale boosters. There were all-star extravaganzas, such as the Irving Berlin show, This Is the Army, starring future Senator George Murphy and future President Ronald Reagan. There was Stage Door Canteen and Hollywood Canteen. There were celebrations of Allied victories, such as Jimmy Doolittle's daring raid in 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, or the crucial sea battle in John Ford's on-the-spot documentary, The Battle of Midway. The vehemently pro-Russian Mission to Moscow was made at the behest of the U.S. government. And documentary after documentary was turned out by directors in the armed forces. There was Frank Capra's Why We Fight series. There was William Wyler's Memphis Belle, or John Huston's The Battle of San Pietro. Even cartoon heroes were rushed into the war effort. Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Donald Duck all entered into the fray. After Donald zapped cartoon Nazis in the Oscar-winning Der Fuhrer's face, Bugs, Daffy, and the gang regularly popped up behind Axis lines, wreaking havoc, screwing up cartoon Hitlers and Mussolinis, driving their goose-stepping foes to distraction. Seldom has the sociological importance of film been more apparent. What the movies did is they laid the psychic groundwork for turmoil. An especially important film in helping to shape the public mood was William Wyler's Mrs. Miniver. The film starred Greer Garson and Walter Pidgeon and dealt with a British family adjusting to the horrors of war. In 1942, the film won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. So let's talk next about the genres that Hollywood used to respond to war. The first response out of Hollywood to the war was a series of espionage and sabotage films. Screen detectives such as Ellery Queen and even Sherlock Holmes, who made a sudden leap into the 20th century, were immediately enmeshed in enemy intrigue at home and abroad, even though there was surprisingly little espionage and sabotage on the home front during World War II. This was Hollywood's immediate reaction. Even Tarzan swung into action against the Nazi foe. These spy melodramas mirrored the general anxiety in the air. To look at these movies, you would have thought America was swarming with spies. But these films were probably most important as outlets for aggressive fantasies about the enemy. At a time when American forces were suffering defeats, these films allowed people to express their emotions cathartically. If at first the sneering villains triumphed, in the end the cocky all-American hero gives them the beating of their lives. The Nazis were crude caricatures who reigned Heil Hitler automatically like robots. A recurring motif in these espionage films was a quarrel between a Japanese and a Nazi spy who in the end betray each other. So let me tell you the story of one of these grade B melodramas called Invisible Agent. John Hall parachutes into Berlin, makes contact with an anti-Hitler spy ring headed by a glamorous, wealthy German courtesan who wheedles secrets out of Nazi officers. Hall and the woman escape to England in a captured Nazi plane, but not before destroying a squadron of Nazi bombers preparing to take off to destroy New York City. Phenomenal fantasies, and these are what people flocked to in the early war era. Another type of spy film enlisted gangsters against the Axis. In Lucky Jordan, Lucky is totally cynical about the war. He tries to get a lawyer to help him evade the military draft. Once he's inducted, Lucky refuses to subordinate himself to military discipline. But eventually, he's redeemed by the love of a USO hostess, and he learns how evil the Nazis are. I don't want to see this country run by guys who beat up old ladies. That's the way he sums up the meaning of the war. In the last scene, Lucky's digging a latrine. He tosses some dirt on a sergeant's foot and says, "Sorry, I thought it was your face." The rebel has been tamed, but the swagger and the toughness remain. A favorite Hollywood theme. Another way that Hollywood appealed to the home front was through guilt. That is, our boys are out there fighting and dying, so what are you doing about it in your cushy civilian life? Such a film was Letter from Bataan. A wounded GI is shown in a Corregidor hospital. He's writing a letter home to his folks. Quote, "For one thing, tell the folks not to hoard food. We haven't had anything but a little horse meat and rice for days. Tell that friend of yours, Mrs. Jackson, to stop bragging about all the coffee and sugar she's got stored up in the cellar. And kitchen fats, Mom. Don't waste any. Kitchen fats make glycerin, and glycerin makes explosives. 2 pounds of fat can fire 5 anti-tank shells. And pass that along to my brother-in-law of mine, who won't use a razor blade twice. It takes 12,000 razor blades for one 2,000-pound bomb." The film ends with the announcement that this was the boy's last letter. He died in the hospital. Guilt is a key message in many of the war films. Another popular theme was the "for want of a nail, the battle was lost." The leading character omits through laziness or carelessness to do some seemingly small act, and through a chain of circumstances practically loses the war. Let me give you an example. Conquered by the Clock. A woman defense worker leaves the assembly line to sneak a smoke in the ladies' restroom. Because of her dereliction, some cartridges without primers are sent out, and a soldier loses his life when his gun won't fire. Of course, the same thing would have happened if she had had to go to the bathroom, but that wouldn't send the proper message. As the war progressed, American forces suffered a series of defeats unprecedented in American history. Hollywood responded to this in very characteristic ways. It tried to radiate a grim seriousness from the screen in its combat pictures that would puncture complacency, puncture overconfidence. A series of pictures dealt with last stands. They glorified American defeats. They provided crumbs of comfort by depicting glorious, isolated, totally fictitious American victories. The first war picture rushed to completion was Wake Island. For dramatic purposes, a feud is carried on between the Marine commandant of the island and the foreman of a civilian construction battalion. Along the way, there is a pause for a little philosophizing. A corporal comes upon a young Marine praying. The Marine is embarrassed, but the corporal says, "Nothing wrong with praying. There are no atheists in foxholes." At the end of the picture, the surrender of the island is not shown. Instead, we see the stars making a last stand in the foxhole. An explosion covers them with smoke, and in the last frame, a grinning Japanese soldier runs up and fires his machine gun down a foxhole. Never show Americans surrendering. This became a tradition in the combat films of World War II. In fact, the Office of War Information cut a scene in the film Bataan because it showed an American flag being lowered and a Japanese flag replacing it. Never show defeat openly. The last stand films always end in a blaze of gunfire. There's catharsis even in defeat. So what I'm trying to suggest is Hollywood's biggest product during World War II was morale. There was an ecstatic release in seeing John Wayne drive a steam shovel at an enemy tank, pick it up, and drop it over a cliff. Or seeing Andy Devine shooting down an enemy plane with a shotgun. Or Errol Flynn spitting out hand grenade pins as if they were grape seeds. What World War II meant for Hollywood was truly a people's war, a war where ordinary Americans rose up to the challenge of defeating the Axis forces. Many wartime movies dealt with heroes who couldn't get moving because of personal problems, age, love, bitterness, jealousy. And of course, Casablanca fits exactly that genre. Nazi propaganda had accused the democracies of being soft, of being overly individualistic, of not being tough enough to face up to the rigors of war. And what these films try to do is to overcome this argument. Casablanca was truly the greatest example of this approach. The war, particularly in its earliest stages, was surrounded by an aura of romance. Today, most of us regard Casablanca largely as a part of Humphrey Bogart lore, but it was truly a war movie. It dealt seriously with the issue of commitment. Bogart never would be happy without Ingrid Bergman, but at that dark moment, personal fulfillment becomes incidental. It didn't amount to a hill of beans, as it's put in the screenplay. Still, when most of us think about war films, we think of GIs. We think of the Lone Patrol, the Italian from the Bronx, the Jewish kid from Brooklyn, the college-bound WASP, all chiding one another about their melting pot origins. All joining in an immense expression of national harmony, albeit one that had yet to be even partially integrated when it came to race. Movies and wars have always been natural allies. The 1915 Birth of a Nation is pretty much a war film that ends with a sort of cavalry rescue, though a quite racist one. But it wasn't until World War II that the war movie truly comes into its own. The cliché platoon has a farm boy from Iowa, a Jew from Brooklyn, and so on. They appear over and over in films like Guadalcanal Diary, Destination Tokyo, Air Force, and Baton. The word that really sums up these movies, I think, is the word rousing. They all tell the same essential story. A group of strangers, many from identifiable minorities, learn to love one another after being tested in battle. These films create a kind of community that this heavily individualistic society had never had before. The fact that these films take place in an all-male world forces them to deal with male friendships, and the picture that they paint is indeed a rosy one. In fact, the beginning of Guadalcanal Diary, when the soldiers sun themselves on the poop deck of their transport and then dance to the latest tune, is reminiscent of nothing so much as a weekend in Galveston. There's even physical intimacy. The way the men keep leaning on each other certainly raised my eyebrows, and there's an oddly sensitive atmosphere. Everyone, it seems, has a monologue about how scared he is, and later they cry when their friends get killed. There's no doubt that a certain love is occurring, a love that is no less stirring for not being sexual. In Purple Heart, the men decide to die together rather than to betray one another. And when it's over, you believe it. Never have the movies been so in love with the war, so committed to the justice of its cause, so certain that the men who were fighting the war were heroes. In other words, World War II allowed Hollywood to turn the movies into noble propaganda. In many respects, it was the triumphant American moment. Ordinary men rose to an extraordinary occasion, fighting terrible evils, longing for nothing more than to return to the small towns where life could proceed unassumingly. The genius of the American movie during World War II was to portray the war as the surpassing moment for the GI. It was the average guy's war, and in the movies he fully possessed it. Even the officers were regular Joes. Even the World War II movies that had elements that were unflattering to the military. For example, John Wayne portrays a sergeant who is often drunk and sometimes brutal in sands of Iwo Jima. In the movies, the Japanese are treated with a scorn bred of hatred for an aggressor, viewed more like animals than like men. Today, when you see those war movies, you can't help but blanch at the open racism. The Japanese are referred to as Tojo and his bug-eyed monkeys in the Fighting Seabees. By VJ, however, VJ Day, Victory Japan Day, Americans had seen all the war films they wanted to see. And war movies had become box office poison, just like I guess Westerns have become today. And for a while, Hollywood virtually stopped making combat movies. And then, in the mid-50s, when the country was at peace and prosperous, Hollywood began to take another look at World War II. And so what I want to talk about next are the war movies of the 1950s, the war movies that probably shaped all of us much more than the combat movies of World War II. The war movie would return to the screen, but with a number of crucial differences. They differed markedly from the films of the early 40s by virtue of the fact that they were not much interested in war. From Here to Eternity ends when the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. The films made during World War II were often preoccupied with articulating the country's war aims, that we were fighting to preserve democracy, freedom, and brotherhood. Those movies made in the 1940s went out of their way to explain why we were fighting the war. 50s movies don't care why we fought. They don't explain it, and they don't care. A common sentiment expressed in one of those war films was this: I don't know why I'm here, but let's get it over with and go home. The 1940s war movies had stressed diversity. Catholics fought side by side with Jews, Brooklyn cabbies with philosophy professors, black men with white men. In the 50s war movies, in contrast, Protestants fight shoulder to shoulder with Protestants. Whites dig foxholes with whites. You saw that in the pictures I showed earlier in our class. Middle-class college kids share their K-rations with other middle-class college kids. It's a very different portrait of America than the wartime version. Films made during World War II often focused on enlisted men, privates, corporals at the bottom of the heap. But the heroes of the 50s war films are very different. They are the officers, something that was not a part of the 40s version. In the 50s war movies, the real enemy is behind the lines. The real drama lies not in combat with Nazis, not in conflict with communists, but in the confrontation between the individual and society represented by the army. And this brings us to the central theme of many war films. The military was now seen as a thuggish place, a place fueled by alcohol and run by sadistic superiors with sexual dysfunctions. Now, this revisionist view is at the heart of a slew of benchmark movies from the 1950s that range in tone from the ironic Mr. Roberts to the grand Caine Mutiny to the ambitious and awful Naked and the Dead. But the best of the bunch, it's generally acknowledged, is From Here to Eternity. It's filmed in black and white, and its justly famous sexual performances don't disappoint you. But if From Here to Eternity is great movie making, its real importance at the moment may be in how it delineates what I'll call the central myth of the military. The central myth of the military. Simply stated, the central myth of the military is the journey of the sensitive misfit into a brutal world that tries to break his will. And virtually every war movie from the 50s to the present has dealt with this story about the military. Now, this myth is like the myth of the Western. It's almost infinitely flexible. It's almost infinitely adaptable. It can even star Goldie Hawn if you want to have this myth and see how it works. It can be seen in a light comedy like Private Benjamin with Goldie Hawn, or it can be seen as high melodrama with Richard Gere in An Officer and a Gentleman. But From Here to Eternity provides the myth in its purest and most thought-provoking form. The sensitive misfit is Private Robert E. Lee Pruitt, played by Montgomery Clift. The new man in the company, Pruitt, refuses to box in the regiment championship because in an earlier fight he blinded a man. And for this, he is given the treatment. That is, he is mercilessly harassed by the major, a pompous skirt chaser. Pruitt's only friend is a drunken loser named Maggio, Frank Sinatra in the role that won him an Oscar. He's brutally beaten in the stockade by a hyper-testosteroned Ernest Borgnine. After killing the Borgnine character in a dark alley, Pruitt goes AWOL, hiding out at his girlfriend's house. She's another outsider. She's a prostitute who yearns to become proper. From Here to Eternity should sound very familiar to you these days, because it sounds just like the stories we've been reading about gays in the military right now. There was just a report from the Pentagon about the harassment that continues to go on in the military towards gay troops even now. While just as masculine as the other troops, Pruitt is decidedly unmacho, and he's a talented musician to boot. His love for the Army, which does nothing but treat him like dirt, is unwavering, just like today's gay and lesbian soldiers. He can't understand why people think he should quit the Army. And the fact is that he's played by Montgomery Clift, an actor now known to have been homosexual, adds yet another layer to the story. Now, the way that central myth is resolved is crucial. But whatever happens, one fact is immutable. The Army always wins. It usually is structured in a pleasant way. The misfit overcomes his flaws and is accepted into what has somehow changed into a happy band of brothers. Or the hero, the misfit, can be a woman, played by Goldie Hawn, and a happy band of sisters. But From Here to Eternity uses the alternative ending, the unhappy one in which the Army kills the misfit. The misfit doesn't just quit. The misfit doesn't just go away. The misfit doesn't just die in a convenient accident. The Army literally kills him. Pruitt is shot while trying to return to base as Pearl Harbor is attacked. The military myth also received searching treatment in the 1967 film Reflections in a Golden Eye. It was one of those oddball, high-budget curiosities they used to make in the 1960s before Hollywood decided that all movies had to affirm life and happiness. This time, the film has Marlon Brando chewing up the scenery as a pathetic, repressed homosexual Captain Penderton. Reflections uses the sensitive misfit myth, but with a twist. This time, the myth is told from the point of view of the tormentor. The tormentor character is always the villain of the piece, Sometimes he's the drill instructor. Sometimes he's the bully in the barracks. Sometimes he's a superior officer. It's usually hinted that he has problems of his own, usually of a sexual nature. And does Captain Penderton have problems? He keeps pictures of naked men in a cigar box. He slathers on his wife's cold cream. He makes funny faces. He talks in a squeaky little voice. He's married to Elizabeth Taylor, who hates his guts and is sleeping with the captain next door, played by Brian Keith. Keith's character, in turn, is worried about his wife, played by Julie Harris. She has mutilated her breasts with a pair of gardening shears, and he's afraid that she might do worse. Enter the sensitive misfit, the extremely good-looking Private Williams. He has no friends, and he seems, well, different. The captain is soon following him around, picking up his discarded candy wrappers to put in his cigar box, and spying on him as he indulges in his favorite hobby, which, fortunately for the captain, happens to be riding horses through the woods without any clothes on. Remember, movies were a lot different 30 years ago than they are today. Who, in this cauldron of emotions, is going to be murdered? But as dictated by the myth, there could only be one possible answer. The army must destroy the sensitive misfit. And this is indeed what happens. Private Williams gets murdered by Captain Penderton, and in such a way that he will get off and the dead private will be blamed for everything. Captain Penderton is clearly driven to murder by his unresolved homosexual yearnings. He must destroy what threatens him so. Today's movies that deal with the military continue to mine the myth of the sensitive misfit. And so let me talk about a few recent films that you've probably all seen that deal with the same kind of themes we've been talking about. You may have seen A Few Good Men. The entire plot revolves around the investigation into the death of a sensitive misfit. Though the provenance of A Few Good Men goes straight back to the great military movies of the 1950s, it's Caine Mutiny crossed with From Here to Eternity, the movie has a twist that breaks with tradition. This time, the truth comes out, and the military's cruelty and deceit are exposed. So let's talk for a moment about the debate in our country about gays in the military. What do you think those films suggest about that? What insight might those films, that long tradition of films dating from the 1950s through the 1990s, what kind of message do they send us about that debate? Any thoughts?
Well, it shows that the public is able to take that kind of movie now, able to see that kind of movie. They can get away with that now.
Well, but they've seen them really for 40 years. Since the, From Here to Eternity, this has been the dominant theme. It's not open. It's not openly about gay characters, usually. It's about sensitive characters that are different.
Well, since Tailhook, the military has not typically won when it's been caught with its pants down. And I think these recent movies reflect that, whereas the older ones still stuck with the wartime, let's portray the military in a good way. For a long time they did.
Though I think they present very ambiguous pictures of the military. I mean, one difference I think about our society now is that when people saw the 50s war movies, most adult men had had some experience in the military. They knew what kind of place the military was. They knew that it was a place that was very hierarchical, very highly disciplined, where there was lots of peer pressure on people. And so when realistic movies about the military are produced for an audience that knows what the military is like, they show this myth of the sensitive misfit. We live in a time when many fewer men have experience in the military, and therefore it comes as much more as a surprise to discover what the military might actually be like.
When you were describing Reflections of a Golden Eye, I've never seen that, but that sounds just like base life from my own experience. Like Selfridge Air Force Base up in Michigan. Exactly like that.
Very interesting. Okay, the next topic that we're going to talk about is the atomic bomb. Because for many Americans, again, what they know about the atomic bomb, they learned it at the movies. Since September 1945, when First Yank in Tokyo brought the mushroom cloud to the screen, hundreds of nuclear films have appeared. Americans have been exposed to several foreign films on the subject. The most notable is Kurosawa's Rhapsody in August, or Black Rain, or the 1959 classic Hiroshima Mon Amour. At least one American nuclear film was truly a work of genius, Dr. Strangelove, and several others explored the issue thoughtfully, such as Failsafe and War Games. But more often, the fear of nuclear war in Hollywood spawned survivalist fantasies. More often, the fear of nuclear war spawned irradiated monster films. More often, Hollywood produced post-apocalypse thrillers. The well-intentioned but dangerously naive scientist became a stock character. This is nothing new. Witness the Frankenstein movie of 1931. But whereas the creations of earlier inventors merely threatened a village, after Hiroshima, they endanger the entire world. What is striking, however, is how few films have anything to say directly about Hiroshima itself. It's as if this is a topic that is truly off limits. Almost all of them are works of pure fiction, imagining nuclear attacks in the near or distant future, while ignoring two instances when atomic weapons truly were used, at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. In fact, if you count up all the times that the real bombs have ever been featured in films, you don't even need a whole hand. You can come up with 3 motion pictures. Only 3 movies have been made about the making or use of the first atomic bombs. American directors exploring Hiroshima seem bound to the docudrama format, a literal approach that makes few emotional demands on the movie's creators or on their audience. Now, ambivalence or guilt is certain to be evoked by any cinematic treatment of Hiroshima. Perhaps that's why all the films made about Hiroshima grapple with the notion of American decency. The 3 Hollywood movies made about Hiroshima have much in common. Each was highly touted and widely advertised. Each was directed by a talented filmmaker, and each was an artistic failure. Each, further, was subject to intense political pressure and intense scrutiny. So they may have been box office failures, but a lot of effort and pressure was put on shaping the way they showed the bomb. So let's start out with the first of these films, The Beginning or the End, from 1947. This controversial MGM film emerged after many revisions. Some were expressly demanded by the White House. It became the Hollywood version of the official Hiroshima narrative. That is, the bomb was necessary to end the war and to save American lives. Early scripts raised doubts about the Hiroshima decision. Early scripts portrayed the effects of the atomic bombing in a way that would have shocked many viewers, with Hiroshima pictured as ghost-like ruins and a baby with a burned face. The overall political message was alarmist and was aligned with pro-disarmament scientists. It would have been better to lose 500,000 American lives than release atomic energy in the world. And needless to say, that's not the movie that would eventually appear. Then something happened, and the entire sensibility of the film was shifted. The decision to use the bomb in revised scripts was viewed as admirable. Now, after the bombing, no victims appear. You just see a burning landscape from the air. General Leslie Groves, the director of the Manhattan Project that had built the bomb, had secured the right of script approval, and he used it in great measure. Even in minor details, the film justifies the bombing. For example, General Groves makes light of nuclear fallout, that it's not dangerous or radioactive. The B-29s flying over Hiroshima are pelted with heavy flak. This is a fabrication. It makes the attack seem that much more courageous. In fact, the plane was not threatened by heavy anti-aircraft fire. And the second bomb, the one dropped on Nagasaki, is not mentioned at all. Yet it was in the script's central melodrama that the true message of the film was conveyed. Matt Cochran is a young scientist arming the bomb. He prevents a chain reaction from blowing up 40,000 people on a Pacific island and therefore exposes himself to a fatal dose of radiation. But just before he dies, Matt concludes, quote, "God has not shown us a new way to destroy ourselves. Atomic energy is the hand he has extended to lift us from the ruins of war and lighten the burdens of peace." Clearly, this completely fictitious episode is important for driving home the film's larger meanings. After screening the finished film, however, this was not enough. President Truman felt uncomfortable with one key sequence. It pictured Truman making the decision to use the bomb. Truman and his aides objected to his deciding after only a brief reflection that the U.S. would use the weapon against Japan because I think more of our American boys than I do of all our enemies. But in fact, that's exactly what Truman did think. He just didn't want to see that attitude expressed on the screen. The MGM screenwriter deleted the offending scene and wrote a new one in which President Truman explains that in his many discussions on the matter, quote, "The consensus of opinion is that the bomb will shorten the war by approximately 1 year." I mean, here we really see the power of government to shape the cinematic depiction of Hiroshima. In the revised version, Truman revealed that the United States would drop leaflets warning the populace of what is coming as a means to save lives. And he predicted that a year less of war will mean life for from 300,000 to 500,000 of America's finest youth. Still, the White House demanded further changes, among them deleting a reference to morally concerned scientists who favored demonstrating the bomb for Japanese leaders in a remote area before dropping it on a city. The beginning or the end billed itself as basically a true story. It received mixed reviews. Time magazine laughed at the film's cheering imbecility, but Variety praised its aura of authenticity and special historical significance. Next, Hollywood dealt with Hiroshima and the bomb in Above and Beyond 1953. This was something of an official production, and while it was not a good movie, it was a very influential movie. The idea for the movie came from a close associate of General Curtis LeMay, then the head of the Strategic Air Command. The film would focus not on scientists, but on the pilots assigned to the mission, and the U.S. military would cooperate fully in the making of this film. Like its predecessor, Above and Beyond emphasized American decency. Paul Tibbets, who flew the Enola Gay on the mission to Hiroshima, surveys the city on fire and says, "Results good." Then he repeats the line, "Results good," filled with grim irony, presumably to show that the men who dropped the bomb recognized the tragic nature of their mission. What is most revealing in Above and Beyond are the film's fabrications. A key scene shows a general testing Tibbets' suitability for the job of flying the first atomic mission. He hands Tibbets a buzzer attached to a cord and asks, "What if you could push that button and end the war, saving 500,000 Americans, but you'd kill 100,000 people in an instant?" Tibbets ponders a moment, then presses the button. With the question phrased that way, one can easily imagine the moviegoers pressing the imaginary buttons on their seat. The night before the mission, Tibbets writes to his mother, the soon-to-be immortalized Enola Gay. She would give her name to the plane that dropped the first atomic bomb. In it, Tibbets admits that he's scared, that he doesn't like dropping a bomb that could kill thousands of people. But it's my job, he writes, and I've got to do it. And so it would next be 3 decades before Hollywood would again look at the atomic bomb. And now the mood in the world was quite different. There's no doubt that the next film, Fat Man and Little Boy, those were the names for the first 2 bombs, was inspired by the anti-nuclear sentiment of the 1980s. The director had previously made The Killing Fields, a movie about the horrors of Cambodia, where a mass self-genocide had killed perhaps 2 million Cambodians. And in this film, he set out to question the official narrative while emphasizing the decency of the scientists who made the bomb. To complicate the plot, he cast Paul Newman a longtime arms control activist who had served in the Pacific in 1945 as General Leslie Groves, who runs the Manhattan Project, building the bomb. The key scene, the scene that would provoke enormous controversy in the mass media, concerned the death of a young scientist from exposure to radiation. In the film, the exposure incident is kept hush-hush. Then the camp physician blurts out that Oak Ridge physicians were injecting patients with plutonium to see its effects on the human body. Even before the film was released, this line became the subject of major stories in newspapers and magazines. One authority told the New York Times, quote, "I'm sure nothing like that happened during the war." On the defensive, the director cut the scene showing a plutonium experiment, but otherwise he stuck by his story, attributing his information to a congressional investigation that first uncovered evidence about the radiation experiments, some of which did take place before Hiroshima. 4 years after the film was released, the Department of Energy released documents confirming the worst about the radiation experiments. It turned out that the scenes that the director had cut from the film were in fact correct, were in fact based on real life. Reviews observed that General Groves expressed his sentiments so much more persuasively than anyone else in the film that the film was stunningly ineffective in promoting anti-bomb views. Next, we're going to move forward and look at post-war Hollywood. No screen show for this. We're going to look at the decline of Hollywood in the next part of our course. Hollywood had reached the peak of its success financially in the year 1946. In 1946, films grossed $1.7 billion. It was the most profitable year in the history of the film industry. In 1946, Americans spent 90 cents of every dollar they spent on leisure at the movies. Weekly attendance in 1946 was 90 million. Compare that to about 7 million a week today. And that meant that 3/4 of all the Americans who could make their way to a movie theater made their way to a movie theater every week. This is astonishing. Yet Hollywood would soon suffer a series of shocks that would topple it from its pinnacle of power. In the space of 7 years, from 1946 to 1953, movie attendance would fall by half, and box office receipts would fall by half. So in the span of just 7 years, the mighty fell heavily to the ground. So what we're going to do next is talk about what happened to Hollywood, why those 7 years were so disastrous for Hollywood, and what it would mean for the movies. And we begin with the year 1947. Begin with 1947. In 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee, better known as HUAC, began witch hunts in Hollywood as it began to look for communist infiltration of the film industry. These witch hunts would inspire a fear of being un-American, and it would encourage Hollywood to produce bland, politically neutral films, particularly in safe genres like musicals and biblical epics. No one ever accused a biblical epic of being unpatriotic. Then, in 1948, a Supreme Court decision would strip Hollywood of its guaranteed market. Before 1948, the film industry was a textbook example of what is called vertical integration. Vertical integration. The studios not only produced films, they also distributed films, and they owned the theaters that exhibited them. It's vertical integration because Hollywood controls every stage of the production, marketing, and distribution process. Every facet of the movie industry was controlled by the studios. Screenwriting, casting, directing, distribution, and exhibition. The 1948 decision was the result of a long-standing government antitrust case against the major studios. And here let me bring a brief digression about government antitrust policies. There are many monopolies or conspiracies against fair trade in the world. OPEC, the oil cartel, being the most obvious example of this around us. But it's only rarely that the government goes after monopolies. And it's very odd which monopolies they go after. They went after Standard Oil in the early 20th century at precisely the moment that Standard Oil was losing its strength in competition with rising foreign oil companies. Pretty odd. And they would later go after the phone company, which provided what everyone agreed was the greatest phone service in the world and the least expensive phone service in the world. And they went after Hollywood when Hollywood was producing the greatest movies it ever did and was exhibiting them at amazingly cheap prices. And what you're going to discover is that after the antitrust case, the cost of admission into movies would increase dramatically. And so it's not quite clear who all this was designed to benefit. Consumers don't seem to be first in line in that answer. Back in 1890, the government had gained the power to prevent monopolistic abuses of power. That's called the Sherman Antitrust Act. And in 1940, the federal government extracted a consent decree from the film industry. The studios agreed to eliminate 3 practices that had shaped the movie industry from its inception in Hollywood. The first is blind bidding. Blind bidding. This required theaters to bid for films that they had not seen before. Okay. The second practice was block booking. Block booking. This required theaters not just to book a single film, but to book a package of films. And the third practice was fixing of admission prices. The studios also agreed to acquire no more theaters, but despite the consent decree, lawsuits against the major studios continued, and they culminated in a Supreme Court decision in 1948, U.S. versus Crescent Amusement Company. Okay. Now let's talk for one moment. Let me ask you a couple of questions. What are the advantages or disadvantages of blind bidding, block booking, and fixed admission prices? Why did Hollywood like those things?
Because you can fix the price. You can set your own price without any competition.
Okay, but what... Go on.
It's possible to budget a movie. You have X amount of theaters who have to purchase it from you. They have to promise you so many revenues. You know the attendance is going to be high because the induction to get in is cheap. It's relatively inexpensive, and you're going to make a profit. Period.
Right. By guaranteeing a profit for all movies, this made investing in films one of the most safe investments imaginable for large financial institutions. Because Hollywood could guarantee that every movie overall will make money. And the pressure is not to raise admissions prices, but often to keep them lower than they might be normally, because you want to make sure that the patrons come in. In 1948, the court held that the studios had conspired to gain a monopoly over the exhibition of first-run films. And the decision reignited the Justice Department antitrust struggle with the studios. The Justice Department case is called U.S. versus Paramount, or it's called the Paramount Decision. A federal district judge ruled that the movies industry distribution system violated the Sherman Antitrust Act, but the district court did not order the studios to sell their theaters. Instead, it simply said that every film must be offered to exhibitors by competitive bidding. The Justice Department then appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ordered the lower court to break up the vertical integration of production, distribution, and exhibition in the film industry. So the system, the studio system that we've talked about so much in our class, comes to an end in 1948. Now, this decision, like many antitrust decisions, has all kinds of ironic, unpredicted consequences. Okay. First of all, as I've already mentioned, it raises ticket prices, because now the owners of the theaters are not the studios who can make money other ways. They're the theater owners themselves. And they have to bid more to get first-run movies, and that forces them to raise ticket prices even higher. As prices rose, fewer people went to the movies. And as fewer people went to the movies, theaters closed. Altogether, 4,000 theaters would close their doors in the 10 years after the Paramount decision. That certainly wasn't what the Justice Department had hoped for, but that was the consequence of this monumental decision. And by 1953, less than a third of all surviving movie theaters are making any money at all on admissions prices. If it wasn't for the popcorn, they would be out of business altogether. Okay, another change involved the outlawing of block booking. With block booking outlawed, distributors had to market each film individually, and producers had to finance each film separately. What difference would that make? What difference would it make if you have to finance each film individually? Any thoughts?
It seemed like it would raise the price of the movie, the cost of the movie.
Okay, it will raise the cost because you have to make sure that it's going to be covered.
You're going to have to make films that you can sell to investors. So they're going to have to be what the investors want to
And
purchase.
what do the investors want?
Profit.
Yeah, but what would they say would be most likely to guarantee them a profit? Okay, movies that are built around stars. Okay, number one would be that feature. They also want movies that are built around established genres. You don't want to make movies that don't have guaranteed audiences. And every genre, from gangster film to war film to woman's film, has a particular audience. If you don't make a film in a genre, it could lead to problems. So big name stars and genre movies would be the outcome of the Paramount decision, and that remains true even to our own time, I think. Also, another disaster for Hollywood in 1948 was that European import tariffs deprived Hollywood of its overseas market. Europe had been one of Hollywood's largest markets. Hollywood made about 40% of its profits from theaters outside the United States and Canada. And so any loss of those foreign markets would be absolutely catastrophic. Take the example of Italy. Each year, Italy imported 600 films from Hollywood. Britain imported $60 million worth of Hollywood films every year. But foreign countries were not very happy with this. Why not? What's their concern? Why not let Hollywood movies come in? Unlimited numbers, if that's what the public wants. Why would they want to limit Hollywood movies? What do you think?
So their movies could be, so their domestically produced movies would be competitive.
Right. They can nurture a domestic film industry, and in addition, they won't see their scarce currency after World War II being exported to the United States. So it seems crucial for them to restrict the number of Hollywood movies. So foreign countries are eager to gain control over the films shown in their country, and they wanted to nurture their own industries. They wanted to stop the outflow of dollars, and so they restricted Hollywood movies. Britain, France, Italy all imposed quotas on the number of foreign films that could be imported. And so, without the built-in profits guaranteed by studios and by studio theater chains and European markets, the kind of movies that Hollywood makes changes. They begin to make more and more movies based on successful novels. They begin to make more and more movies based on successful Broadway plays. The originality and inventiveness of the studio system is beginning to fade. The next development, one that we're all familiar with, is the disappearing audience. The disappearing audience. Perhaps the biggest problem that Hollywood faced after World War II was that its traditional audience began to decline in size. What was the traditional Hollywood audience like? What was it? What was it like? Youth? Was it a youth audience?
It was a working class.
What was it? It was urban.
Working class.
It was exceptionally broad. It was what I will call a vast, homogeneous audience. Movies had to be made so that there be something in every movie that appealed to every imaginable person in the audience. But the assumption is that the audience is huge and you do not segment it. Right? Today, movies are very segmented. There are movies for preteens. There are movies for teenagers. There's movies for boys in their 20s. There's movies for every imaginable audience that you can think of. But that was not the way classic Hollywood thought. Classic Hollywood expected everyone to be in the audience for any movie. So Radio City Music Hall has 5,000 seats. One of those new multiplexes with 30 screens had 5,000 seats. But obviously the philosophy is very different, right? At Radio City Music Hall, they're all sitting in the same theater watching the same film. But in the Cineplex out on Beltway 8, you have 30 different audiences that are very different from each other. So the next development that would be the most difficult for Hollywood to cope with is the fragmentation of the mass homogeneous audience. Let's stop there.